Picture this. May 7th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day, -1. The Third Reich has surrendered, Hitler is dead, and across Germany the guns are finally falling silent. But in a medieval castle perched on a cliff overlooking the Rhine River, an American brigadier general named Marcus Bradford is about to make a decision that will erase him from history. At 0823 hours, he radios 1st Army headquarters with a routine status update. By 0900 hours, all communication from his position has ceased. Search parties sent to investigate will find the castle empty, Bradford's entire staff vanished, and no evidence that anyone had been there for weeks. For 77 years, the military will insist that General Marcus Bradford died in a vehicle accident during the war's final days. But the truth, buried beneath layers of classified documents and official denial, is far more complex and infinitely more disturbing. Marcus Bradford wasn't a household name like Patton or Eisenhower. He operated in the shadows, commanding specialized units that handled tasks the Pentagon preferred to keep quiet. Born in 1902 in Philadelphia to a family with military traditions stretching back to the Revolution, Bradford had graduated West Point in 1923 and spent the interwar years in intelligence postings across Europe. By 1939, he spoke 5 languages fluently, had personal contacts with resistance movements in a dozen countries, and possessed an understanding of European politics that made him invaluable when war came. His wartime service was distinguished but deliberately obscured. He'd helped coordinate resistance operations in France, managed prisoner interrogations that produced critical intelligence, and by early 1945 had been assigned to what military documents vaguely described as recovery operations. The official explanation was that Bradford's unit located and secured important documents and equipment from collapsing German positions. But those who worked with him knew the truth was stranger. Bradford was hunting something specific, something the Germans had been developing in secret, something that Allied High Command wanted found before the Soviets arrived. The castle he'd chosen as his command post was Schloss Rabenfels, Castle of the Ravens Cliff, a 13th-century fortress that had been requisitioned by the Wehrmacht in 1943 for purposes that remained unclear even after Germany's collapse. Intelligence reports suggested it had housed a research facility, possibly related to advanced weapons development, possibly something else. By the time Bradford's unit arrived on May 2, 1945, the Germans had evacuated, leaving behind empty rooms and a few scattered documents that hinted at work far beyond conventional military technology. Bradford's staff consisted of 17 hand-picked specialists, intelligence officers, cryptographers, 2 scientists recruited from the Manhattan Project, and a demolitions expert named Captain Robert Chen, who'd survived the entire European campaign without a scratch. They were chosen not just for their skills, but for their discretion. Everything they did was classified at levels that ensured none of them could speak freely about their work even decades later. Most never got the chance. Of the 17 men who entered Schloss Rabenfels with Bradford in early May 1945, only 3 would ever be seen again, and their stories would be so contradictory, so impossible, that military investigators would eventually classify them as mentally unfit and confine them to institutions where they died without ever receiving public hearings. The castle itself was remarkable, a stone fortress built into the cliff face with parts of its structure extending into natural caves that honeycombed the rock. Medieval builders had incorporated these caves into the castle's design, creating storage areas, escape routes, and, according to local legends, chambers where ancient rituals had been performed centuries before Christianity reached the Rhine Valley. The Germans had been interested in those caves. Bradford's preliminary surveys found evidence of extensive excavation, reinforced tunnels, and electrical wiring that descended deep into the rock to locations that shouldn't exist according to structural engineering principles. On May 5th, Bradford sent a coded message to Army intelligence describing what his team had found. The message, declassified in 2018 under sustained pressure from historians, was cryptic but alarming. Facility extends 4 levels beneath castle structure, evidence of power generation equipment far in excess of normal requirements. Documentation suggests German research into gravitational anomalies and field manipulation. Local population describes lights and sounds from Kassel during 1944, phenomena that match theoretical predictions for dimensional stress. Recommend immediate visit from project specialists. The message was received and acknowledged. The specialists were dispatched. They never arrived. Or rather, they arrived on May 8th to find the castle abandoned. The intervening 3 days, May 6th through 8th, remain a void in the historical record. Bradford's unit maintained radio silence, unusual but not unprecedented given the sensitive nature of their work. When First Army attempted contact on the morning of May 7th, they received Bradford's final transmission, a brief acknowledgement that was routine in every way except for one detail noticed only by the communications officer who logged it. The timestamp on Bradford's transmission was wrong, not by much, just 3 seconds. But in military radio protocols, timing was everything, synchronized to atomic standards. A 3-second discrepancy suggested equipment malfunction or deliberate alteration. Neither explanation made sense. The first investigator to reach Schloss Rabenfels on May 8th was Colonel James Harrison, an intelligence officer who'd worked with Bradford in France and considered him a friend. Harrison's report, filed that evening and immediately classified, painted a picture of abandonment so complete it seemed staged. The castle was empty, but undisturbed. Equipment was neatly stored. Documents were organized in filing cabinets. The kitchen showed signs of a meal prepared but never eaten, food still on plates that sat on a table set for 18 men. Bradford's office contained his personal effects, his uniform jacket hung on a chair, his service revolver in its holster on his desk. Everything suggested the occupants had simply stood up and walked away mid-task, intending to return momentarily. But they'd left no note, no indication of where they'd gone. And most disturbing to Harrison, the entrance to the lower levels, to the caves where Bradford's team had been conducting their investigation, was sealed. Not locked. Sealed. Someone had poured concrete into the stairwell, filling it completely, creating a barrier that would require days of demolition work to penetrate. Harrison found Bradford's seal ring pressed into the concrete before it had hardened, as if he'd wanted to leave proof that he'd been the one to close that door. Permanently. Harrison ordered the seal excavated immediately. It took 48 hours of continuous work with jackhammers and cutting torches. By the time they breached the barrier on May 10th, the war had been over for 2 days, and the geopolitical landscape was already shifting toward the Cold War that would define the next half-century. What lay beyond that sealed stairwell would complicate that landscape in ways that Harrison couldn't have imagined. The first level below the castle was a German research laboratory, abandoned but intact. The equipment was sophisticated, far beyond what military intelligence had expected to find in a medieval castle in rural Germany. Electron microscopes that shouldn't have existed in 1945. Computing machines using technology that wouldn't be publicly developed for another decade. And schematics, hundreds of pages of technical drawings showing devices whose purpose Harrison's team couldn't begin to comprehend. But it was the second level that stopped them cold. The excavation had been extensive, the natural caves expanded into a chamber easily 50 meters across, and in the center of that chamber, surrounded by equipment that hummed with residual power despite being abandoned for days, was a structure. Not built. Found. Archaeological teams brought in to examine it estimated its age at somewhere between 8 and 12,000 years. But the construction techniques, the materials used, the geometric precision of its design, all suggested technology that predated known civilization by millennia, and all suggested purpose that went far beyond simple architecture. The structure was circular, 20 meters in diameter, constructed from a material that appeared to be stone but showed properties that no geological analysis could explain. Its surface was carved with symbols that matched no known language, though cryptographers noted disturbing similarities to patterns found in ancient sites across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Sites that had no historical connection to each other, that had been built by cultures separated by oceans and millennia, yet all showing the same geometric patterns, the same incomprehensible script, and surrounding the structure, positioned as if they'd been conducting some kind of experiment or ritual when time stopped, were 17 sets of equipment. Not bodies, not remains. Just equipment, carefully arranged, still connected to power sources that shouldn't have been functional. 17 positions. For 18 men. Bradford's command post had housed 18 people. Where was the 18th? They found him on the 3rd level, the deepest part of the complex. General Marcus Bradford sat in a chair facing the structure above him, visible through a deliberate opening in the chamber floor. He'd been dead for at least 3 days, but the cause of death was impossible to determine. No wounds, no signs of violence. He simply appeared to have stopped living, as if someone had switched off whatever spark animated him. And clutched in his hands was a journal, leather-bound and filled with handwriting that forensic analysis would confirm as Bradford's own. The journal began on May 5, 1945, the day Bradford had sent his final official message. We've opened the 4th level. What we found there changes everything we thought we knew about human history, about civilization's origins, about our place in time and space. The Germans knew. That's why they came here. That's why they spent 3 years excavating, studying, trying to understand. And that's why they sealed it and fled. Because they'd seen what happens when you go too far, when you open doors that were closed for reasons we're only beginning to comprehend. May 6th brought entries that suggested Bradford had descended into something far darker than a historical discovery. The structure is active. We didn't turn it on. We didn't touch anything. It activated on its own when we breached the final chamber. As if it had been waiting. As if it knew we would eventually find it. The symbols aren't decorative. They're functional. Instructions. Warnings. Both. The Germans had translated portions of it. Their notes speak of cycles, of civilizations that rose and fell and rose again, always reaching this same point, always making this same discovery, always choosing wrong. The final entry was dated May 7th, written in handwriting so erratic it was barely legible. I've made my decision. The structure offers knowledge, technology beyond anything we've imagined. But the price is everything. Every civilization that activated it was given a choice. Take the knowledge and advance beyond all natural limits. Or walk away and remain ignorant but free. Every one of them chose knowledge. And every one of them disappeared. The structure shows you what they became. What waits on the other side of that choice. I can't let America make that mistake. I can't let anyone make it. I'm sealing the complex. The concrete will buy us time, maybe centuries, maybe forever. And I'm staying. Someone has to make sure the door stays closed. Someone has to choose ignorance over extinction. Colonel Harrison stood in that chamber, reading Bradford's final words by flashlight, and understood the impossible situation he faced. Return to command with the truth about what had been found here? The military would immediately reopen the site, study the structure, probably activate it despite Bradford's warnings. The Cold War was starting. The Soviet Union was a threat. Any technology, any advantage would be pursued regardless of risk. Or he could honor Bradford's sacrifice. Seal the complex again, bury the truth, and hope that future generations would be wiser than his own. Harrison made his choice. The complex was sealed. Completely. The castle itself was demolished, officially due to structural damage from the war. The land was declared contaminated with unexploded ordnance and fenced off. And General Marcus Bradford was declared killed in a vehicle accident on May 7, 1945, his body supposedly buried in an unmarked grave that was later lost to administrative error. A convenient story, a comfortable lie, a decision that haunted Harrison for the rest of his life. But secrets buried aren't secrets forgotten. For 77 years, Schloss Rabenfels remained sealed, its location known only to a handful of aging officers who took their knowledge to graves scattered across America. until 2022 when a German construction company began preparing the site for development, unaware of what lay beneath centuries of accumulated earth and debris, unaware that they were about to rediscover what General Marcus Bradford had given his life to keep hidden, unaware that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. The construction crew struck the first anomaly on June 3, 2022. A bulldozer attempting to level the site for foundation work broke through what appeared to be solid ground, revealing a void beneath. Site supervisor Klaus Hoffmann immediately halted operations and contacted local authorities, assuming they'd discovered an old cellar or perhaps a wartime bunker. Within hours, ground-penetrating radar teams arrived and confirmed what Hoffmann had suspected but hadn't dared voice. The site wasn't just hollow beneath the surface. It was massive, extending 4 levels deep into the cliff, exactly as Colonel Harrison's classified report had described 77 years earlier. The German Federal Archives were consulted. Historical records showed Schloss Rabenfels had been demolished in 1945 due to war damage, the land declared contaminated and sealed. But there was no record of what had been beneath the castle. No blueprints, no surveys. Just a brief notation that the site had been under American military control immediately after the war, and then transferred to German authorities with strict prohibitions against development. Prohibitions that had somehow been overlooked when the construction permits were issued in 2021. Dr. Hannah Weber, an archaeologist from Heidelberg University, was assigned to lead the excavation. She approached it as a historical curiosity, expecting to find perhaps some medieval artifacts or wartime military equipment. What she found instead, when her team finally breached the sealed entrance on June 18, 2022, was a complex that shouldn't exist, not because of its age or construction, but because everything inside looked as if it had been abandoned yesterday. The first level was General Bradford's command post, preserved by the sealed environment exactly as Harrison had described it in 1945. Documents sat on desks. Equipment stood ready for use. And in the kitchen, 77-year-old food sat on plates, mummified but recognizable, arranged for a meal that 18 men never ate. Dr. Weber's team photographed everything, cataloged every item, treating it as a time capsule from the final days of World War II. But it was when they descended to the second level that the nature of the discovery changed completely. The German laboratory was functional. Not preserved, functional. Power still flowed through circuits that should have died decades ago. Computer systems, primitive by modern standards but impossibly advanced for 1945, displayed readouts in languages that mixed German technical terms with symbols that matched no known alphabet. And the schematics scattered across workbenches showed technology that Dr. Weber's team couldn't begin to understand. Devices that appeared to manipulate gravitational fields. Equations that suggested methods of accessing dimensions beyond the conventional 4. But nothing prepared them for the third level. The chamber carved from living rock, the ancient structure rising from its center like a monument to civilizations that predated recorded history. Dr. Weber stood at the entrance to that chamber for 15 minutes, unable to move, unable to process what she was seeing. Because she recognized the symbols carved into that structure. She'd seen them before in photographs from archaeological sites across the world. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan, Tiwanaku in Bolivia, structures separated by oceans and millennia, yet all bearing the same geometric patterns, the same incomprehensible script. The team's radiation specialist detected elevated readings immediately, not dangerous, but present. A specific spectrum that suggested the structure had been active recently. Very recently. Within days, not decades. Dr. Weber ordered everyone back to the surface while she consulted with experts. But before they could retreat, one of her graduate students, a young man named Thomas Keller, noticed something that everyone else had missed. Footprints in the dust covering the chamber floor. Fresh footprints, leading to and from the structure. 17 sets. and they were recent enough that they disturbed centuries-old dust without being covered by new accumulation. The implications were impossible. The complex had been sealed for 77 years. No one could have entered. Yet someone had been here. Multiple people, recently enough that their passage was still visible. Dr. Weber photographed the prints, took measurements, and then made the decision that would define the rest of her career. She followed them. The prints led to the 4th level, accessed through a stairwell so narrow that excavation equipment couldn't follow. Dr. Weber descended with only a flashlight and a camera, violating every safety protocol, driven by a compulsion she couldn't explain. The 4th level was natural cave, expanded minimally, carved into the bedrock beneath the castle. And in the center of that cave, arranged in a circle around a deeper pit, were 17 skeletons in American military uniforms. Forensic examination would later confirm what Dr. Weber already knew standing in that chamber. These were Bradford's missing officers, the 17 men who'd vanished with him in May 1945. But they hadn't died of violence or accident. They'd died of old age, extreme old age. Skeletal analysis suggested they'd lived decades beyond normal human lifespan, their bones showing patterns of stress and regeneration that indicated they'd remained alive and active in this chamber for far longer than should have been possible. And positioned at the edge of the pit, sitting in a chair that faced the structure above, was General Marcus Bradford himself. His skeleton still wore his uniform, insignia intact, his journal clutched in bone hands. But, unlike the others, Bradford showed evidence of something else. His bones bore marks that no pathologist could explain. Spiral patterns etched into the skeletal structure itself, as if his body had been subjected to forces that rewrote him at a cellular level. And his skull showed modifications, small holes drilled with impossible precision into areas of the brain associated with consciousness and memory. Dr. Weber opened Bradford's journal with trembling hands. The entries she'd read in archived military reports ended on May 7, 1945. But this journal continued, for 77 years. Entries made in darkness by a man who should have been dead, who'd chosen to remain in this chamber standing guard over something that terrified him more than death itself. May 8, 1945. The others have completed the first transition. I can hear their thoughts now, not as words, but as presences. They've merged with the structure, become part of whatever network it represents. They say it's transcendence. They say they can see across time, across dimensions, understand truths that human minds weren't designed to comprehend. But I can also hear their screaming, the parts of them that remain human, trapped in an existence they don't understand, experiencing consciousness in ways that break everything we are. I won't join them. I'll stay human. I'll stay guard. The entries continued sporadically. 1950, 1963, 1978. Each one shorter, more cryptic, as if Bradford was losing the ability to translate his thoughts into words. 1984. The structure is patient. It doesn't demand. It offers knowledge, power, the ability to transcend human limitations and join something vast and eternal. But it never mentions the price. The others learned it too late. They're not individuals anymore. They're fragments of consciousness, scattered across the network, experiencing existence from perspectives we were never meant to access. They're alive, they're aware, but they're not them anymore. The final entry was dated June 1st, 2022, 2 weeks before the construction crew had broken through. They're coming. The new seekers. I felt the structure activating, preparing for their arrival. My vigil is ending. I've lasted 77 years, far beyond what should have been possible. The structure sustained me because I was useful, a guardian it couldn't corrupt. But my time is done. Whoever finds this, know that the structure isn't evil. It's a tool, a test. Every civilization that reaches a certain level of development finds one, and every civilization faces the same choice. transcend your limitations and lose your humanity, or remain limited and stay yourself. There is no middle ground. There is no safe exploration. The moment you activate it, you're given the choice. And the moment you choose, you're committed. My men chose transcendence. They thought they'd stay themselves while gaining power. They were wrong. I chose guardianship. I stayed human by refusing the knowledge. But someone will eventually choose differently. Someone always does. The question is whether humanity can survive their choice. Dr. Weber stood in that chamber, reading Bradford's final warning, and understood the impossible situation she faced. Report this discovery truthfully, and governments around the world would race to study the structure, to unlock its secrets, to access the power it promised. Or seal the complex again, bury the truth, and hope that future generations would never find it. But she knew that was impossible. The structure was already active. The construction work had triggered it somehow, and if her team could find it, others would too. The only question was whether they'd be ready for the choice it represented. The German government made its decision within days. The site was declared a biological hazard, sealed with concrete and reclassified as permanently contaminated. The construction project was canceled, the company compensated, and the land was purchased by a shell corporation that technically didn't exist. Dr. Weber and her team were required to sign documents that threatened imprisonment for disclosure. The artifacts recovered from the upper levels were classified and disappeared into storage facilities that had no official existence. But Bradford's journal was copied before it was sealed away. Multiple copies, distributed to intelligence agencies across the Western world. And in classified briefings held in secure facilities in Washington, London, Berlin, and Moscow, military and scientific leaders studied Bradford's 77-year vigil and debated what it meant. Because Schloss Rabenfels wasn't unique. Similar structures had been found beneath ancient sites around the world, and all of them showed recent activity. All of them were waking up. The most disturbing revelation came from deep analysis of the skeletal remains of Bradford's 17 officers. Their DNA showed modifications, changes that couldn't have occurred naturally. Changes that suggested whatever they'd become wasn't entirely human anymore, even after death. And electromagnetic scans of the chamber detected patterns, residual energy signatures that suggested consciousness might not require living tissue, that the 17 men who'd chosen transcendence might still exist in some form, merged with the structure, waiting for someone new to join the network they'd become. In 2023, a year after the discovery, Dr. Weber published a sanitized account of the excavation, describing it as a forgotten World War II command post with historical but not strategic significance. The paper was dry, academic, revealing nothing of consequence. But those who knew her noticed the change, the way she avoided underground spaces, the nightmares she mentioned once to a colleague about being offered choices that erased everything you were, the way she'd resigned from archaeology and moved to a small village in the Alps, as far from ancient sites and buried structures as she could manage. And sometimes, late at night, she would write in her own journal about the question that haunted her. Bradford had stood guard for 77 years, sacrificing his life to keep humanity from making a choice he believed would destroy us. But was he right? Or had he simply been afraid of evolution, of transformation, of becoming something greater than the limited creatures we currently are? The 17 officers who'd chosen transcendence had screamed, yes. But they'd also achieved something that Bradford admitted he couldn't understand. They'd joined a network that spanned time and space, that connected ancient civilizations across millennia, that promised knowledge beyond human comprehension. Would their choice destroy humanity, or save it? And if every civilization eventually faced this test, how many had passed? How many had chosen transcendence and disappeared from conventional reality, ascending to levels of existence we couldn't perceive? And were they destroyed? Or were they still out there, watching from perspectives we couldn't imagine, waiting for us to join them? General Marcus Bradford died believing he'd saved humanity by keeping us ignorant. But 77 years later, with structures activating around the world, with the network waking after millennia of dormancy, the choice he'd prevented was being offered again, to every nation, to every person who discovered what lay beneath ancient sites, to a species standing at a threshold that every civilization before us had faced. Transcend and risk losing your humanity, or remain limited and eventually die as a species bound to a single planet in a vast universe that may be filled with civilizations that chose differently. Bradford's journal ended with a question. Can humanity make the choice I couldn't? Can we evolve without losing ourselves? Or will we be the next civilization that disappears into the network, leaving behind empty cities and warnings that no one will heed? Beneath the ruins of Schloss Rabenfels, sealed behind concrete and official denial, the structure waits, patient, eternal, offering a choice that every civilization eventually faces. And somewhere in the darkness, 17 consciousnesses that used to be American officers exist in states that transcend conventional understanding, experiencing existence in ways they can't communicate to those still trapped in linear time and limited perception. They're not dead, they're not exactly alive, but they're aware. And they're waiting for humanity to make the choice they made. Waiting to see if we'll join the network that spans civilizations and centuries. Waiting to discover if we're brave enough to transcend or wise enough to refuse. General Marcus Bradford believed that wisdom meant remaining human. But 77 years after his death, with structures waking across the world and humanity standing at the threshold of transformation, the question remains open. Are we the generation that finally makes a different choice? Or will we, like Bradford, choose guardianship over transcendence, ignorance over evolution, and hope that future generations will be grateful we kept the door closed? The structure doesn't care. It simply waits, patient, eternal, offering a choice that will define our species' future. And somewhere in the darkness beneath German soil, the network pulses with ancient consciousness, waiting for new minds to join the communion that spans millennia. The choice is coming. The question is whether we're ready to make it. This story was intense, but this one on the right is even more insane. You won't believe what they discovered.